Moving on, let's continue with the second half of configuring the process workflow. Now that we have configured the process workflow to generate a purchase order in Activo, and in the last video, we left at the step of clicking the Create button, and we added a 5-second delay after the click. Now, we want to update the spreadsheet with the generated purchase order number. If we come to the Activo, you will see that after we clicking the Create button, there will be a purchase order number generated. And we want to capture this number and use this number to update the purchase order spreadsheet. So now let's go back to our studio. After the clicking Create button, let's add an activity called Get Text. Let's indicate the purchase order number here. Now let's go to the selector of the Get Text. And as you can see, the name of this field is purchase order specific, which means different purchase order will have different purchase order number. So if this number is in the selector, then we will have issue generalizing this activity to other purchase orders. To make this generalizable, let's replace the number with a wildcard and click OK. To save the value that we captured, let's go to the output and create a variable named PO number. Let's use this number to update our purchase order spreadsheet. Now let's open our purchase order spreadsheet and see how we can update the purchase order number. Here, column G is where we are going to insert the purchase order number. We are going to use a matching technique to make sure that we are inserting in the correct position. And this matching technique is that we are going to use the combination of the supplier name and the item name. For example, if the supplier name is Cisco and the item name is router, then based on that combination, the purchase order should be put in G3 because for this transaction, the supplier name is Cisco and item name is router. Let's see how we can operationalize this in UiPath. First, let's obtain the data from the purchase order Excel spreadsheet. And to do that, let's use a read range activity. And I choose the read range from the workbook automation. For the workbook path, that is data/purchaseorders.xlxx. And let's leave the range as blank. And in output, let's create a variable to store the data table. And let's name it as dtpo. Now let's use a for each row activity. For each row in the dtpo that we just created, and then we need to use an if activity. Here, the condition is the matching principle that I mentioned before. So if the row of the supplier to string concatenated with the row of item name to string, if this concatenated string equals to our string value of the supplier concatenated with our string value of the item name, if this is true, then we write the purchase order number into the corresponding cell. So here, in the then branch, let's insert a write cell activity. And I also use the write cell from the workbook automation. Now, for the workbook path, it's still data/purchaseorders.xlxx. And in the cell content, we want to write the purchase order number. So here let's input the PO number that we generated before that stores the purchase order number we captured. Now the question is, which cell should we write the purchase order into? Obviously, it's not cell A1. As we discussed before, we are going to insert the purchase order number into column G. And as for which row should we insert this number, it depends on the combination of the supplier and item name. So here, let me show you a trick of how to achieve this. Now let's come back to our studio and let's create a variable. And let's name the variable as count. And the variable type is integer. And here, let's set the default value of this count as 2. The reason we set the default value for the count as 2 is that in our spreadsheet, the first cell available to be written in is cell G2. And then it's G3, G4, and G5. So by setting the default value of the count as 2, we are setting a starting point for the search. Now let's come back to the studio. And here, we replace the cell value as G plus count toString. Here, this is a string concatenation. We define that the column should be column number G, and for the row number, we use the variable count to decide. Now, after the if activity, let's use an assign activity. Here, we are going to add count by 1. Now, let me explain to you how this will work. For example, if the purchase order generated is for Avaya and the item phone, then by the activities we configured here, the if activity will check the condition for each row. For the first row, Lenovo concatenated with laptop is not the same with Avaya concatenated with phone. So in the if activity, the else section will be triggered, and there is nothing in the else section. Then the count will be added by 1. So in the next iteration, the if activity will check whether Cisco concatenated with router is the same as Avaya concatenated with phone. And in that case, it's still false. So it will go to else again. And no activities are here, so no value will be inserted into cell G3. So here, count will be added again by 1, and then our count will be 4. So now it's time to check row number 4. And here, Avaya concatenated with phone matches with Avaya concatenated with phone. So here, the then branch will be triggered. And then the right cell will write the purchase order number to cell G4. Next, the assign activity will continue adding 1 to the count, so now count is 5. And then the if will check row number 5. And here, HP concatenated with monitor does not match with Avaya concatenated with phone, so this will pass and no number will be inserted. So in this way, we can make sure that the purchase order number will be inserted in the correct match of the supplier and item name. Now let's save our workflow. And so far, we have completed the try box of our try catch activity. So now let's collapse all the activities in our try block. And now let's come to the catches and add a new catch. Let's add the exception as system.exception. And in the activity inside the catches, let's use log message activity. And let's set log level as error. And in the message, we can say unable to generate purchase order due to this error. And concatenated with exception.message. Now let's save this workflow. Now we have completed configuring the process workflow. Now let's come back to the main workflow. Here, we do not need to change anything else because in the end process, we have pre-configured activities that we can use directly. Now let's test our automation. First, close our Optivo tab. And we also want to make sure that our orchestrator is connected. And also make sure that in your queues, there are enough unprocessed transactions. If you haven't run the dispatcher, then run it again. Make sure that you have transactions in your queue. Now, I have a final note before you run the automation. You must have noticed that when we generate a purchase order, the Create button is at the very bottom. So if you move your cursor down towards the right corner of your screen, it may activate the taskbar. And that may interfere with the activity that clicks the Create button. To avoid this conflict, let's set the taskbar to be on the left. And to do that, let's go to your taskbar and right-click and go to the taskbar settings. Now in the setting here, let's set the taskbar location on screen as left. And now close this. Because we can see the elements highlighted. Now make sure that you are on the main workflow and now click the Run button.